Christianity has a tremendous need for a psychology like Jung's, and the widespread interest on the part of Christians in his psychology can be taken as a recognition of that fact. But the Jungian-Christian dialogue has been going on for more than 40 years, and something keeps it from flourishing. In this series of profiles, we're going to meet people involved in different facets of this dialogue and try to discover what is happening in it today and what hopes there are for it in the future. Today we are in Chicago, near the Baha'i Temple, to talk with Thomas and Mary Ellen Lavin.
My name is Tom Lavin, and background, had I not studied to be, background in terms of how I got into Jungian psychology in the beginning, or really I think more than Jungian psychology, the person of Jung, what the person of Jung did for me. And I was in a Roman Catholic seminary, and I was on the verge of leaving after a year and a half, and I really felt that I was losing my soul. I was doing what I was told to do. I was studying philosophy, and at age 19, metaphysics in Latin, and courses were in Latin, and textbooks were in Latin, and everything was in Latin. And I felt I was losing my soul. Not only that, but there was also a community problem, because people around me were having nervous breakdowns. And I felt that this, I'll go into Latin, qui regula vivit, Deus vivit, kind of summed up the whole mentality. If you live according to a rule, you are living the life, the divine life. And I found that I was strangled by rules, but then I was 19, and that's normal. But when you bring God into it, that makes it worse. At any rate, I was ready to leave, and a friend said, "Don't leave dumb, leave smart. And it would be important for you to read more than philosophy and Latin before you leave. It's February, you can't get into another school anyway. Here's a list of books." And at the top of his list was Carl Gustav Jung, another person by the name of Goldbrunner, Joseph Goldbrunner, a book called Holiness is Wholeness. And that really touched me right away, because I said, there's something psychologically sick about this holiness stuff. But then it must be me. It must be my fault. Anyway, I did read Jung. And from the very beginning of reading Jung, and what I was given to read was psychological types, and the inference was that, at least the school I went to, God loves extroverted thinkers best. Well, I don't know who she loves best, really, but at that time, that was a strong inference. And as a helpless intuitive, I didn't know what to do. And all of a sudden began to read that there's a place for everyone in the kingdom, in humanity, in life. You know, that there's a place for every woman and every man and every type, and that every type has its own genius that can really serve other people, and in that case for me, the church as well. And I couldn't get enough of Jung. But at the same time, I'm reading Freud, Maslow. Carl Rogers was big. Time frame, we're talking 1961 at this particular time. Eventually, I left the seminary. I did stay. I didn't quit. I stayed for 2 more years of philosophy and 3 years of theology. And prior to what would have been my ordination to the then at that time subdiaconate and diaconate, the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago and I agreed to disagree. He felt that canon law, there was a future for me in canon law, and if I wanted to study in Europe, I could go to Rome. I, on the other hand, felt that my gifts were in other areas and wanted to go to Zurich and study Jung and then really come back and work with priests and nuns, because by that time I was very much aware of what an ecclesiogenic neurosis was. And so really it was my own pain. It wasn't like, gee, it would be a neat idea to study Jung. It was my pain and the pain of people that I was studying with, working with, and not knowing what to do about this or for this. But knowing that Jung's psychology was deep enough and wide enough to give me a foundation for a physics of the soul that I didn't see in other psychologies. Not that they didn't have a dynamic, not that there wasn't a lot of truth and a lot of genius, and I say that still today about Freud and Maslow and Rogers and others. But it's almost as though their containers were a bit small for the inner conflict, real religious conflict that I was feeling inside of myself. And I began to read Jung at this man's suggestion, and among other people. But I thought, yeah, Jung's where it's at for me. So I didn't get ordained. My own ethic was, how can I speak to people from a pulpit about the heart of God if I don't know anything about the heart of a person? Now, other people could do what they wanted, but I wanted to find out more about the person and her or his relationship with the divine. And I had to do that. So that's what got me to Zurich. I think it's really important to get a flavor of Zurich, what Zurich was, what training was, right after Jung died. Because I showed up to Zurich in late 66, early 67. So Jung died in 61. And it was really a little village. I likened it to, like, do you remember the old double cookers, the oatmeal double cookers? Zurich at that time was a double cooker, in that you were cooked not only in your own analytical vessel, your own therapy, but the whole community was a vessel for becoming an analyst. Everybody knew everybody. I think many times too many people were in one another's business, but that's my value judgment. But it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating time. I had corresponded while I was still in the seminary with Goldbrenner and said, I would like to come over as a deacon or a priest and study Jung at the Jung Institute right there. And what about that? And he said, fine, come on. First, it would be good if you learned German. So I did that in Germany at the Goethe Institute. And Then went down to Zurich, and I walked into, I was studying at the University of Munich at the time, and I walked into the Director of Studies and said, "Hi, I'm Tom Lavin. I'd like to become an analyst." And Goldbrunner sent me. And he said, "Really?" He said, "We didn't get your letter." And I said, "I didn't write one. I'm here." And he said, "Why not?" He was very kind. He said, "Why not come and have a cup of coffee?" So we talked about being an analyst, and I said I'd come from the seminary in Chicago. And he said, "Had you ever been analyzed?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Not 1 hour of analysis?" I said, "No." And he said, "Are you against being, I mean, you know that analysis is the core of training. You do want to be analyzed, don't you?" And I said, "Well, if I could get a buy on that, I kind of feel I have my shit together." And I came out of the seminary, so I couldn't get in a hell of a lot of trouble. And he said, "You want to buy on analysis?" Really? I said, "Well, I come really to learn how to do this with other people." And he said, "Oh, if they did make you, if the curatorium of the Jung Institute made you have analysis, who would you have analysis with?" And I said, "Well, Goldbrunner said this, Professor Meyer and Dr. Fry are very good, and they work together. And you're supposed to work twice a week with a man and twice a week with a woman, 4 times. I guess I'd work with them." He said, "Do you have any idea that people wait years to work with these?" I said, "No." "Well, see, that probably means I should get a buy." And he said, "Why don't you call C.A. Meyer up, Professor Meyer up, and see if you can get an appointment before you go back to Munich." So I did. And I walked into Meyer's office on Steinwiestrasse and sat down. Meyer looks at me, peers over his glasses, and he said, first question was, "What's a buy? What means buy?" I look it up, B-U-Y. I said, "No, it's B-Y-E. But he said, "You don't want analysis, do you?" And I said, "Well, I don't mind, but I'd rather not go through this." And he laughed. And he said, "Now you come from the Jesuiten." I said, "Yes, the Jesuits." He said, "How's your Latin?" And I said, "Well, I speak it and read it and write it fluently." He said, "Oh." So he got up, went over to the library, pulled out Cicero or Julius Caesar that I probably couldn't translate today. And he said, "Translate." And so I did. And he said, "Oh, that's very good. That is very good. For an American, it's exquisite." He said, "How's your Greek?" And I said, "Well, it's kind of," he said, "Up." And he got up and took out Xenophon or somebody, or Gospel of John in Greek. So I translated. He said, "But for an American, that's very good." And then said, "Und jetzt, was ist mit der deutschen Sprache?" And so we began speaking in German. And after 10 minutes, he stopped and he said in English, "Herr Lavin, you're educable. We will start on Monday. I will talk to Dr. Fry. You will see us 4 times a week, twice with me, twice with hers. Bring the dreams, we get started." And that was the beginning of the trip. Years later, I got a letter. I was in therapy for 11 and a half years, the kid that didn't want it and wanted to buy. 11 and a half years later, sometimes 4 times a week, sometimes 2, whatever. I got a letter from Meyer, from Zurich, and he said, "I'd like you to be my biographer." And I cried. I thought, he's got all these Swiss guys, you know. Then he really mentored and was one of them. He asked me. I couldn't believe it. But I went over, and I have got about 30 hours on tape. stories, just Isaiah's stories, and about himself, about Jung, so on. Anyway, it's all written, done. It's in Italian now, but sooner or later it'll be published in English. And I asked Meyer, I said before he died, and he died last summer, this time, well, November. But Mary Ellen and I were there last summer, and I said, I've got 30 hours of stories, good stories about you and Jung and whatever, and may I do whatever I want with them? He said, of course, I wouldn't have asked you to be my biographer if I didn't trust your discretion. So there's some stories that I'm sure sooner or later will come out. But he was wonderful in his way. It's very interesting. And Liliana was wonderful in her way. And I would think, oh God, you know, here I am bringing in the same dream. He's going to talk about it. I've already written it out, interpreted it. It's going to be so boring. I never had a boring hour. Because they worked wonderfully, typologically, what they were interested in, different nuances, gender nuances that were there. And I really didn't need a buy. And so and at that time everyone knew everyone and knew who was going to whom and so on. And there were all sorts of biases in terms of who loved Jung the most and was the better follower and so on. And someone gave me very good advice when I got to Zurich. He took me out to dinner, to lunch at the Kronenhalle. And over lunch he said, look, we've got some camps here. And there's this camp, and this is in this one, and this is in this one. Basically, do your dream work, do your active imagination, take your courses, do your reading, do your analysis, and don't get caught up with the Jungian collective. And that's the same advice I'd give to somebody right now. Don't come in taking sides, and the whites and the blacks, or the greens and the reds, or what have you. Oh, I've got a wonderful dream I can tell you. Because I was to start, maybe, with, once I got in, I thought maybe I should be working with Yolanda Jacobi, the only Catholic. Because I'm a Catholic. And instead of Liliana Fry, who was Protestant. One of the most spiritual persons I've ever met in my life. But again, should I go with the Catholic? Because most priests went to Yolanda Jacobi. Well, I'm still thinking about this. I have a dream. I'm standing on the bank of the Limmat River, major river that goes through Zurich, and I'm looking at the guild house across the way. They had all of these guild Häuser, houses for carpenters and so on. So I'm looking at the Zimmerleuten, the Carpenters Guild Hall, and there are two doors. One door says Dr. Liliana Fry, and the other door says Dr. Yolanda Jacobi. And I'm standing there looking like this at the two doors, and this old Swiss man comes up next to me. And he says, in Schweizerdeutsch, he says, kann ich Ihnen helfen? And I said, can I help you? And I looked and smiled, and he said, sind Sie verloren? Are you lost? And I smiled at him. I said, yeah, I am, but not the way you think. But thanks for your help. I don't need your help. And he looked at me, and he said, look, after the first floor, it's all the same. It doesn't make any difference what door you go into first, whether Fry or Meyer, and then he or Fry or Jacobi, and then he vanished, and that was the end of the dream. And so I went with my heart and went with the Protestant, instead of sort of duty-bound going with the Catholic, because after the beginnings of work with the soul, it's all the same. In the beginning, the personality and the gender of the person you work with is indeed going to influence you, but not determine you. And so after the Guildhäuser had maybe 5 floors. And after the first encounter with someone who is in touch with her or his soul, doesn't make any difference where you go. The process has begun. You'll never be the same. And then you can begin to enjoy. It's not a question of right or wrong anymore, you know? It's a question of growing in a whole sense of gratitude about who you're becoming. And that makes up. But in the beginning, there's struggling, and you have to deal with shadow stuff and the dark side and talking to people about things that you've never talked to anybody about. And that's why I chose to begin with a woman. Because I could always talk with the guys in the seminary. That was no problem, but I thought, but with a woman? And so that's how I began. I think that we have to look at contemporary Catholic groups as a group of people who are deflated. People who have not been given or have not given themselves permission to experience the Spirit within. So that we, instead of inspired, we're deflated as a group. You know, and I'm not only talking about Catholic Christianity either. I mean, the amount of our friends and relatives that are on Prozac in this country must be saying something. It's a metaphor as well as a necessity, you know, of what's going on in our culture. And when things aren't going right in culture, then we have to look at cult and creed and codes. If a culture is deflated and depressed and down, then we have to look at the same root, you see, of cult culture, and say, we have cultures of bacteria. We have cultures, in other words, something that gets special care is a culture. Something or even person that feels themselves to be different or special or in need of special care, because that's the root word etymologically, cultus. Somehow special care is not being given. People don't feel they're special. People feel rather robot-y. People feel that they've lost their spirit. Now, it's not named, but if you travel around the country lecturing, as you do, you know, you notice that there's a tremendous hunger for things of the spirit. There's a tremendous longing for a return of the soul. I mean, Thomas More has done a wonderful thing, you know, in allowing the word soul to be used again in polite company, okay, or even academic company. Now, people are using that word again. It's used in many ways. I don't care how it's used. But that it again is coming into common parlance is very important. That we have a realization that we're more than just our egos. Now, what happens to, let's just take the Catholic Christian culture. What type of special attention is needed or necessary? A special care for this culture. I think we need to be aware of our own energy, first and foremost. If you're inspired, you're aware of your breath. You're aware of the life force. I remember our youngest son, Brian. The church, we went to the Newman Center, and we still do at Northwestern University, not far from here. And they had the gospel choir from Holy Cross Church down on the south side. And they came up and they sang. And after Mass, little Brian, who's about 6 or 7 then, turns to us and says, "Can we go down to 29th and Cottage Grove every Sunday for church? This is neat." Out of the mouths of babes. There was something where he was touched. I'm not saying that we all go to gospel choirs, but that something was touched in this child. Something very important. Music will touch the soul. There's a soullessness about contemporary Catholic practice. It's sad. All of the icons. Remember Joseph Campbell? So Bill Moyers asked him, well, where's your church? And Campbell kind of leans back and smiles and says, "Well, my parish is Chartres." That's where the icons are. Huh? There's energy with the icon. The people in the East, the Byzantine painter will fast before she or he paints an icon. There is a ritual to portraying an aspect of the divine. There's soul in it. Okay? But sometimes I think that a wrangler in Wyoming knows more about soul than a PhD in theology. Salve reverencia. But I mean that. Because you'll go to the corral in Wyoming and he'll say, "You ride a lot? You want a spirited horse? You want Bess? Or do you want Harry over here?" It's kind of sway back. He knows what spirit is. He has a working definition of what spirit is. And you know the presence of spirit. You know, well, that's an important thing, but it's not. It's more than semantics. It's a whole cosmology. The difference between spirit and soul. That we have spirit. How do you know we have spirit? How do you know we have Neuma right here in Lake Michigan? Because they're waves. Oh, we can see the sails. We know that the wind is there only through its effects. We don't know windy in a vacuum. You know spirit, and you also, by the way, know archetype presence because of its effects. And when that spirit is embodied, like in a person, you have soul, or soul food. And when the soul leaves the body, Thomas from Aquinas, okay, we go back into the realm of spirit. All Souls Day, All Saints Day. We have a whole rich tradition in history to become remembered to become mindful of. To understand that we as a people, for whatever cultural reasons, and there's no blaming, because blaming is futile and often unkind. And the ones we blame the most are ourselves. I mean, sure, it makes money for analysts, but it doesn't do you any good, okay? The idea of how do we get the soul back? How do we get yeast back into the body of Christ is a pivotal question. And I think it's a question that needs to be addressed not in RCIA or Christ Renews His Parish or Mary Renews Our Home, or I don't know, but rather in very small groups of people who are open to one another's wondering. And that whole idea of culture, cult, we have a cell forming in this bacterial culture. And I think that there are cells of deeply caring, probing, feeling people who do want to feel their own spirit in their persons, in the church. And we do have to look at spiritualities. And I don't like the word spirituality, to tell you the truth. It bothers the hell out. I understand it. You know the story of Baal Shem Tov? You know, the Hasidical story about the rabbi who finds the divine light in the forest, and then his followers find the place where Baal Shem Tov used to find the light, and then several decades later they know that there's some forest, some place where one could talk to the divine, they say. How many degrees are we removed from numinosity? How many degrees are we removed from the road to Emmaus? Not in terms of what happens in a church, but also our intercourse with one another, whether that be marital or social intercourse. There's many. The German word is geistlos. We're spiritless. And that is the primary neurotic condition that we have to begin addressing as the Muslims call us, as the people of the book. We have a moral obligation. I mean, it seems to me, a moral imperative, inner imperative, to begin to open our hearts and our minds up to our legacy. Christianity is an aristocracy of the spirit, if we really look at it. But it's almost like, oh no, I don't. Because I don't want to deal with the ethical obligations, the ethos. People who are on a spiritual path are people who have pep, i.e., they're positive, they're energetic, and they're playful. What happens when we get bottlenecked? I think the whole question of loss of soul is one thing. Often that it doesn't get that bad, that people become completely dispirited. But we can say that things don't flow, or they're not in flow, or that things get bottlenecked, that people can't feel their own energy anymore. They don't feel inspired anymore. And then they leave. And they go looking here, there, and elsewhere for something that will break the bottleneck. And I think there are a couple things here. One important thing that Jung's psychology can offer, religion as an institution, is to validate the 8 functions or vectors of energy. That thinking people learn that they can feel, feeling people can learn that they can think. You see, with thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition, we can overuse them and then lose our spirit. That's one. Or we can lose the spirit, the effervescence, if you will, because we are bottlenecked. Energy is not able to get through. And that happens very much when you are with people who try to push the divine into a sensation, thinking, intuitive, or feeling way. Each energy has its own history within the church. The thinkers are the dogmatists. The sensation function people are the fundamentalists. It's right there and that's it. Dot for dot, crossing T's and so on. But they bring us back to basics. Feeling people are enthusiastic, entheu originally, in God or in the divine. They stand out many times, or feel they have to, or stand up or give witness. And intuitives, God help them, us, are people who really need to have a vision to get the energy going. We need the icon. We need to visualize. And so you have people who need facts. Other people are very much interested in form. Other people are interested in feeling. Other people are interested in fantasy. And the 4 F's, if you will. And to realize there's a place for all of this outside and inside. I don't have to be guilty about who I am energetically, that my physics is what it should be energetically, and nor do I have to point fingers, as we Christians have done for millennia now, at other people who don't see the divine, who don't approach as an extrovert the divine, or receive the divine as an introvert the way I do. It's all sibling rivalry. And to get beyond that to a sense of a dynamic family where everybody belongs, that's not going to end suffering, but it will end a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of lack of support, that's there. I think there's a great distinction that we can make between being broken and broken open. All of us have been broken-hearted because of under-information, misinformation, no information about how we can approach the divine as individuals and as a group. The question of the divine is always going to bring pain with it. But we have to ask ourselves the question, am I a person who's been broken, or am I broken open? And I would submit that there's an ocean of difference, clinically, or experience. There's an ocean of difference between a broken-hearted person and a person whose heart has been broken open because of family suffering or personal suffering, bodily illnesses, or what have you. Let's look at our brokenness as a broken openness, and that there is hope for us as individuals and as a people. We're not a divine joke, even though we're very often confused. And I think sometimes just to sit back and wonder and laugh. We're all fools. Now, what was the worst thing as a kid? Don't make a fool out of yourself, right? Don't make a fool out of you. You're going out, you're representing our family. Don't make a fool out of yourself. I think inherent in the Gospels is make a fool out of yourself. Become foolish for Christ's sake, or Buddha's sake, or whoever's sake you want to be foolish for, understanding the archetype of the fool. Being able to laugh, and then to come back really refreshed, to be able, as Jung was, and I think this is one of Jung's greatest contributions, as he viewed Christianity, he was able to be in the valley and on the peak at the same time, or switch from one to the other. This is so important, because a meeting of Christians should not always sound like the annual meeting of the survivors of the Bataan Death March. The keening that goes on, the wailing that goes on. We're all victims, and I guess we have to take up our cross and so on. Well, what about crossing over? I think we stay too much in the archetype of the martyr victim. We've forgotten how to dance. We've forgotten how to walk around, how to circumambulate mystery, because we're too busy climbing, remember Campbell's line, climbing the ladder, and now we're senior persons of Our Lady of the Last Thorn, and we find out that the ladder's up against the wrong wall. And that's devastating for those who are 50-something or 60-something, and they've paid pew rent for years, since they were kids. And now they're beginning to wonder whether the Grail has left the Grail Castle. And in some places it has. And they know they have to pick up again. But I think the problem is this, not being too overly abstract. The problem is this: do I lose hope in the Grail? Do I lose the energy for the quest just because I can't find it in my diocese or my parish or, my subculture? I think the importance of the quest is still on. It's still every morning, every dawning is an occasion of wonder, not a source of temptation or despair. And I think that's what Jung adds very much to this, that the hope is psychologically justified, that the church, like an individual, to go through shadowy times, okay, or to know negative soul energy, these are stages on the process. That's not the end of the line. And so as we make our circular journey and go into deeper dimensions of understanding, coming to terms with our life cycle and the cycle of the divine, we can be and should be very hopeful. Because in any intimate relationship we have a cycle of expansion, contraction, and resolution.
My name is Mary Ellen O'Hare Lavin, and I was born here in the city of Chicago and have a slight background in Jungian psychology, but I do want to start by telling a little bit about myself, because I think it's important to describe this journey from an experience that I had. I was born into an Irish Catholic family. My father was from Ireland, and he died when I was 5 months old, leaving my mother to raise 3 children without much financial support. And I grew up in the Catholic Church. One of the major things that my mother felt that she had to do was to make sure that the 3 of us received a Catholic education. This was the least and the most important thing that she could do as a mother. And so my mother cleaned houses, and this was how we were able to support ourselves. Well, when I got to a certain age, I had to decide what I was going to do with my life. And I knew that as a woman, living in a poverty of such that I didn't have money, I had a rich life, but it wasn't financially supported. I knew that perhaps I could get an education by going into the church. And so I joined the convent. And I lived the life of poverty, chastity, and obedience for 8 years. I also was able to earn a degree, a bachelor's degree, which was very important to me as a young woman in the 1960s. And I lived the life of a religious, but during that time I also was in communication with my now husband, Tom Lavin. Tom had been in the seminary, and he and I would communicate while we were living our religious life. And when I was asked to make final vows, or to take my final vows, I somehow was not drawn to the life of a celibate, nor was I drawn to the life of poverty or that sort of life. And so I said no, that I wanted to leave. And I wrote Tom a letter. He was studying in Zurich at the time at the Jung Institute. And I said, I'm going to be leaving the convent. And Tom said, oh, that's wonderful, because now we can get married. And I said, wait, I'm not ready for that. I want to go out and find my life as a young woman, as an educator, or step out into the world. I've been in a cloistered existence. And so Tom came home from Zurich that summer, and he and I were married. And we were married in October, and 1 week later he scooped me off and we went to live in Zurich. The irony was that we had no money, we had high hopes, and I knew nothing about this man Jung. And I really didn't care, to be honest with you. And when we got to Zurich, I avoided the Jung Institute as much as I possibly could, because I didn't feel that I fit in, and I didn't understand the whole idea. Although I did enjoy people that I had met, namely Liliana Fry and Freddie Meyer and Yolanda Jacobi, and we had some nice conversations, and I was not enthralled with them, but I did enjoy visiting with them, and they were very inclusive with me. But my mode of operation was to be a wife and a mother. I think because of my religious experience, I saw that as the ideal for me, to be the support of my husband, who was a student at the time. And I eventually became pregnant very soon. Tom and I often laugh. We thought that perhaps because we'd both been in religious life, we'd been saving up that seed. So we got pregnant quite fast and quite often. We, of course, weren't able to afford to stay in Zurich. It got very expensive, so we moved to Munich, where Tom worked for the military, and I was a teacher in the elementary school system. We eventually then came back to Zurich because Tom needed to finish his studies. And it was at that time that I realized that perhaps it would be a good idea for me to have analysis. I mean, here was the opportunity of a lifetime. And we lived in this lovely little flat outside of Zurich called Pfaffhausen. And once a week I would get on the tram with, at that time, 2 children in tow, and I would take them down to the department store, Jamoli's, as I recall. Jamoli's had an agreement with the women of Zurich. They would babysit for them while the women of Zurich would shop. Well, I would drop the children off in the nursery under the pretense that I was going to go shopping. And instead I would hop on the trolley and go over and meet with Mary Breener. And I did this for a year. I was in analysis with Mary Breener. And while the children were in the nursery at the store, and then I would pick them up afterward, and we would go home, and that's how we lived our life. And that's how I was introduced to Jungian psychology and to paying attention to my dreams and becoming perhaps more involved in a soul search that I hadn't found in religious life or in organized religion. I do want to backtrack. I want to share a dream with you, which I think was very important at the time that I made the decision to leave the convent. I had a dream that I was in a boat with another friend, and we were in our nun's habit, and I had my ring, which I still wear, which is very interesting because the ring actually belonged to my great-grandmother, and somehow I was playing with it on my finger, and the ring fell off and went into the lake. And so I said to my friend, I have to go in search of the ring. It's very important to me. And I dove into the water, and I couldn't find the ring that I was supposed to receive or wear if I had taken final vows as a religious. Instead, I found another ring, a ring that was made of brushed gold. And I can remember diving down into the water in the dream. It was so vivid. And I came up, and I was not wet. I was still intact. And I held the ring, and I looked around to see if anyone knew to whom the ring belonged. And there was an older man standing on a bridge, and he waved at me, and I asked him if the ring was his, and he said it was, but that he had thrown it in. It was from his wife who had died, and that I could have the ring. And that dream happened 28 years ago. But I still remember interpreting it somehow that I was giving up the ring of religious life and I was finding another ring, a ring of more significance for me, a new life. And I think that probably was, the dream was probably helping me make that transition from religious life to married life, which is what we did. After many years living in Europe and being in the background of Tom, as you know and can tell, is very extroverted and I'm very introverted. And that's probably why we married one another, because we complement one another in a lot of ways. I realized after raising our children that, and they are now aged 26, 25, and 20, but when they were, about in their late teens, I decided that I wanted to return to school. And I took Tom for a walk along Lake Michigan, and I said to him, Tom, I've backed you in everything that you've done in becoming an analyst and becoming a psychologist, and I want to go back, and I want to get my degree now. And Tom said, well, of course. He said, absolutely, without a doubt. And so I did, after raising the children and turning, almost turning 50. I returned to class to earn my own doctorate in clinical psychology. And I looked around for an institute that would honor my needs to deal with soul. And I found an institute, and it was in Santa Barbara, California, and many of you probably know about it. It's Pacifica Graduate Institute. And every month for 3 years, I got on an airplane and flew to Santa Barbara. And I would come home, and on Monday morning I would go in and teach at a school that I was teaching. So it's been a long journey of making my connection with Jungian psychology and honoring that intellectual side that had not been honored as a young woman within the Roman Catholic Church. And I feel that it was a very important part of my own development to go back and become something other than. So it's been a long journey. Several months ago, Tom and I were invited to talk to the Cardinal of Chicago, Cardinal Bernardine. We were among many invited guests, helpers, mental health helpers. And I sat with a group of people who were nodding in agreement with the Cardinal. And I really, truly felt very sorry for the Cardinal, because he told a very sad story, as I recall. The reason for the conference was because he was having a great deal of difficulty in the Archdiocese of Chicago with pedophilia and with homosexual priests. And he didn't know how to deal with it. And he had called us together to get some feedback and some help. And he began by telling a sad story. He said, I went to a conference, and he said, I was the only clergy person there. And at one point I had to use the men's room. And he said, I walked into the men's room and I looked in the mirror. And he said, I saw myself with my Roman collar. And he said, I put my hand up this way. And he said, a tinge of, I'm not with my own. He wasn't with his brothers, the priests. And he implied that he was embarrassed, not ashamed, but he didn't know how to deal with his feelings at that time. And it was a very sad statement. I think the whole crowd of people sitting listening to him felt very sympathetic to him. And then he began talking about the sadness that he was feeling because of the amount of repercussion from priests who had abused young children in his diocese, the litigation that was going on in the Archdiocese, the number of priests who were declaring that they were homosexual, a number of priests who had died of AIDS, and his sadness about this. And I was sitting there thinking, because of my own development, I am still a Roman Catholic, but I think I'm on the fringe because my Catholicity is centered around a more nurturing feminine image, if you will. And I sat and listened to the cardinal with my heart pumping and my jugular moving on my neck, because I knew I had to say something to this man. My husband looked over at me and he said, "Oh, there she goes, she's going to say something." So I raised my hand and I said, "Your Eminence, I have great empathy for what you've expressed, but I must tell you that unless you let the feminine in the front door in a positive fashion, she will come in, but she'll come in the back door in a negative. And I'm afraid that's what you have with regard to the problems that you're experiencing." And I said, "Furthermore, the word seminary has the same etymology as the word semen, and I think you're not teaching your young men what to do with their semen." Well, I must admit the reaction I got from him was disbelief. I'm not sure if he was angry, disappointed, surprised, what his reaction. It was just a blank stare, and I thought, oh my Lord, what did I say? But somehow I was moved not by who I am as a person, but from some inner spirit, inner part of me that had to speak that. And it seems so very obvious to me that the church has not let the feminine in, and I don't see that feminine being honored even in the next few years. Hopefully by the end of the year 2099 we will see some changes in the church. But as it stands right now, there's no place for women. In fact, when it comes to the Our Father, I can't say the Our Father at Mass. I halt and I wait. And when we get to the part that says, "Give us this day our daily bread," then I join in. Because I can't think of my church as kingdoms and powers and glories. That has nothing to say to me as a woman. I'm a woman who nurtures and helps and gardens and needs bread and embraces. I'm not a woman who carries staffs and runs kingdoms, and so I can't identify with that. And the church, to me, seems to leave my type of person out on the stairs. We're welcome, but we're only welcome with certain stipulations. And so I said that to the cardinal, and I must admit I haven't been invited back to any more meetings. And you know, that's all right. That's okay, because it's their loss.